Good afternoon to everyone. Um, it's a good occasion to share with you the situation of migrant workers, particularly from the perspective of migrant workers themselves and from the countries of origin, the experiences of migrant workers as they start to come home from the destination countries because of the pandemic. Since the 1990s, labor migration and migrant workers' efforts to control their lives has come a long way. When they were just mere commodities during that period, this time around, they are now becoming visible, one, and becoming more vocal about the situation that and the abuses that they experience. Now, as we talk about migrant workers in the ASEAN, I would like to underscore the character of the ASEAN and Timor-Leste, as we know that when people write about ASEAN and Timor-Leste, it's an understanding of labor migration that is conscious of shared history and heritage, and also an appreciation of the multi-diversity of the region. And because of migration, this is what has brought the kind of, what do they say in the language now? The DNA of Southeast Asians. ASEAN is one of the more active regional cooperation blocs implementing many of its agreements and declarations, including those or underscoring those declarations and agreements that has to do with trade and investments. It has also on the social front active work and agreements on social contracts on women and children, education and culture. However, in the area of migration, ASEAN is sadly quiet, kind of skirting around the issue, and very consciously neglecting the area of responsibility and accountability. Here is if you can see the map of Southeast Asia and Timor-Leste, you will find that multiculturalism and diversity very rich. And you will find that this region has what we would call a lot of commonalities. On the other hand, when it comes to migrant workers, we have something like 6.5 million migrants from ASEAN and two ASEAN countries of destination. They represent a very neglected part of the population. The reason why we could not get a strong declaration for migrant workers' rights and dignity in the ASEAN is because what is primary to the ASEAN is the recognition of the sovereignty of each country to determine its own immigration policies on entry and conditions to remain. Although we have what we call, a visa-free entry for ASEAN citizens, the conditions for remaining in the country is very stringent. The other reason is the decision-making principle of consensus. Within the ASEAN region, we have at least four net migrant receiving countries, that is Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, and Brunei. When we raise the issue of migrants' rights and dignity in the ASEAN, immediately what is juxtaposed to us is the principle of non-interference in the affairs of each member country, which is why we don't get too much. We don't get a response, in fact, on what happened to Myanmar. Although there is a declaration of ASEAN on the Rohingya, when it came to the coup in Myanmar, ASEAN was pretty silent on that. And yet, what is beneficial to the receiving countries in the ASEAN, more liberal policies were adopted. For example, the entry and stay of skilled migrants, such as accountants, engineers, techies, medical professionals, particularly in this period, and media included. The diversity of the ASEAN and Timor-Leste, where migration has played a major role. And in its history, there had been in and out migration of Chinese, Indians, Polynesians, Melanesians, and Malays that contributed to its multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious, multilinguistic gender and class complexion. Now, this complexion of Southeast Asia and Timor-Leste could never be disregarded. But this character also should be able to bring out the richness of the Southeast Asian experience, including migration. Now, let me tell you a story where the media, as we are now addressing you, journalists and media people, the critical role that media plays in society and in particular in migration. The story that I will share with you now is just Suparmi's story. Otherwise, we'll go on and on with the next stories. But Suparmi is an Indonesian foreign domestic worker, which they Indonesians call the TKW or Tenaga Kerja Wanita. She's from Ponorogo, East Java. She worked in Hong Kong as a domestic worker. She took the drudgery of housework and the care of two young children without a single day of rest for more than a year. What broke the camel's back, so to say, for Suparmi was her not being paid her salary for a year. According to the employer, the money was paying for the cost of her recruitment. So for that period, she was wondering what has happened to her mother and to her children because they depended on her salary. So when she couldn't take it anymore, she asked her employer to leave employment, go home, or get another job. The employer said, no, you can't do that. You can only go back to Indonesia. And now. So he said, no, not that soon. But she was asked to pack her bags and showed the door that she will go there as soon as the recruitment agent comes to pick her up. When she refused to do this, she started shouting, which the Filipino neighbor heard and said, call the police, please. I want to go and complain. Fortunate for her, Hong Kong laws are working. So the police came and said, you cannot detain her inside the house, neither can you force her to go where she doesn't want to go. So the police released her and told the employer and the agent they had no right whatsoever to keep Suparmi. The Filipino brought her to the Asian Migrant Center, which was an office that assisted domestic workers of different nationalities. There, she was advised to file a case and money claims with the Labor Department. So the next day, she went to the Labor Department. But at the Labor Department, two consulate staff were waiting for her, and there was a tug of war between the consulate officials and the migrants who were trying to help Suparmi. A labor officer happily came out and told the consulate guys that they should leave Suparmi alone. And Suparmi came home, went back to the Asian Migrant Center, and started to call her friends and tell them, I'm okay, don't worry about me. The following day, 6 other Indonesians came to the center to file their own complaints. This time, the consulate was conscious of what was happening, was informed of what was happening by the recruitment agencies and the employers. So the consulate went to the AMC and tried to come to a compromise. According to them, they said it's better to have a compromise. You know, this is the Asian way. So we will return the passports. We will allow them to go and process their cases, receive the money claims, and go home. In exchange, we will ask you not to breathe a word of this situation to the media in Hong Kong. The consulate knew the power of the media in Hong Kong. The takeaways, AMC could not make a decision, so the takeaways pleaded, saying, please agree to that because we only need the money so we can go home and give the money to our family. AMC had its partner organization in Jakarta and informed them that this is the situation, and if the women return to Jakarta to help them get safely to their homes. So 2 weeks passed and peace was there. Cases were in progress, but suddenly 2 takeaways on their way to the legal aid department were taken by 2 men from the consulate, brought to the airport and put on a plane to Jakarta. The women, so distressed, arrived in Jakarta but did not go home because they were told by their family that when you arrive home, we will all be harassed. So they went straight to the partner organization and told their story. This angered the partner, and they called a press conference so that the families and the migrant workers can be interviewed. No one came. Only the editor of Suara Pembaruhan, who responded and dispatched an investigative reporter to Hong Kong. To make a long story short, the journalist wrote the first story, and his media contact in Hong Kong collaborated to write a series of news stories that went front page in Jakarta and Hong Kong at the same time. If it was in this day and age, it would have been called viral. From then on, media in Jakarta became bolder in reporting the abuses, not only in Hong Kong, but also in Singapore, Malaysia, and the Middle East. My friends, that was the day when the pen was mightier than the sword. It was hair-raising for us. It took more than a decade or two to build the strength of migrant workers. The issues and problems of migrant workers in Southeast Asia is deep rooted. Poverty, corruption. In our case, I would like to emphasize economic mismanagement. In the destination country, it is job security and the lack of social protection. I don't have to elaborate on the social protection. It has been discussed adequately by Mahi. The vulnerability of those in elementary jobs where they get arrested because they don't have a passport or they don't have an ID. But the multi-layered discrimination and xenophobia is one of the hurtful, to say the least, of the problems that migrant workers face every single day. To be shouted at in Chinese, in Bahasa, they don't understand, but they know it's a very bad language used to them. And that is a daily experience for many of the migrant workers. Because of the multi-diversity of the ASEAN, there is also the multi-layered discrimination of gender, of class, of nationality, of religion, and all those differences in the ASEAN and Timor-Leste. Other problems also had to do with the porous borders of the ASEAN region, where many of the migrant workers and their children end up stateless, end up trafficked because they don't have the proper documents and they are not able to have to go to a process to redress their grievances and have an identity problem. So we had ties, for example, not ties, that is, we had Karen women with fake documents trafficked to Taiwan. And in Taiwan, the labor attaché in Taiwan, the labor attaché of Thailand in Taiwan would not recognize them because they were not Thai citizens. So these are the issues and problems that were earlier elaborated. But 2 decades or so, migrant workers, mostly migrant women, were now building strength. That there was no way for them to just sit back, wait for the employer to be what they call transformed, or wait for the government to be enlightened. They had to act themselves. So came the Rights and Roots movement. Rights is about migrant workers claiming their rights and exercising them. The migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong were able to have labor attaches in Taiwan and in Hong Kong because they lobbied very strongly. The Thai consulate and the Thai government, labor department in Bangkok. The Indonesian migrant women were able to defy the orders of the Indonesian consulate to quietly go home if abused. After the Suparmi story, the Suparmi case, thousands literally came to the Asian Migrant Center to ask whether they would be able to be assisted if they filed complaints. What they did was not just to ask for help, but to organize themselves. Now the Indonesian migrants have a union, strongly unionized Indonesian migrant women, and they have a representation of the union from the different parts of Southeast Asia, a branch in Singapore and in Malaysia, and they have also in Indonesia. Interesting for migrant domestic workers unions who were part of the crafting of the ILO Convention 189. Sorry, it's not 181, it's 189. It is the standard setting of domestic workers. It has 31, I think, 31 countries that have ratified it. And it is the responsibility of the state party, when it ratifies that convention, to formalize the status of domestic workers in their country as part of the formal labor force. So this is a huge step for domestic workers. So in the many host countries, Singapore, Malaysia, what started as just hometown associations became unions, savings associations, coalitions, and alliances, even across nationalities. The momentum of Rights and Roots gave rise to many more campaigns. The Roots campaign is about addressing the root cause, which is poverty and joblessness. And so instead of going home in disarray and in bad shape, planning for going home must become a part of their preparation in the destination countries. Savings associations were organized in Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, and Hong Kong. Migrant families and partner organizations in the home countries were also organized to build the ground for acquiring assets, investing, and creating their own jobs. This may be a decade old, but I would like to share the Indonesian migrants in East Java from Blitar and from Jember, who were able to build businesses for themselves and for the community and create jobs for others in the community. So that is the Rights and Roots movement. At present, the campaigns are what they call the Our Hands campaign, which is peer education, teaching others their rights and joining into the whole movement. Recently, the justice campaign for wage theft against migrant workers during COVID-19. When COVID-19 started, many employers just told their migrant workers to go home, and the migrant workers were also, worried about their situation and worried about their families. So going home was uppermost in their mind. But what happened was that their wages were not paid. Their travel costs were borne by the sending governments. Philippines had to charter planes to bring migrant workers back. Many of the employers just said, you want to go home, just like that. So right now, some of the migrant workers are filing cases, but then file cases to which office? The National Labor Commission in the Philippines is most of the time locked down. Now, what was the impact of the pandemic on migrant workers? In the receiving countries, in the countries of destination, particularly the migrant workers were had no access to health and medical services. In Thailand, for example, they were completely ignored. The priority is for the locals. The listing of people to be vaccinated are the locals. Some migrant workers, they don't exist. In Singapore, there was already a big problem in the dormitories because there was no social distancing was taking place there. They did not have jobs, and so they were just huddled into the dormitories. And what do we expect in a situation like that? So uh, many of the migrant workers had the problems of COVID-19. And even vaccination to be paid by the migrant workers was not there because the supply of vaccines was limited. The loss of jobs and livelihood. This is, how do we say, uh, an overarching problem where a loss of remittance by the household, a loss of remittance of the community, and loss of remittance of the economy is, in my country, is more than uh, a tragedy. 10% of our GDP comes from remittances, and that's a lot. Now, what can a remittance do? Or what does a remittance do pre-COVID? It is used to pay for the schools. It is used to pay for the teachers. It is used to pay the drivers who bring students back and forth from school and back. It is used to buy food. It is used to pay the sellers, in the vendors, the market, the wet markets, the supermarkets. Without this, what happens? Without the remittances, then what happens? And the lack of capacity of government to respond to immediate and medium-term needs of returning migrant workers. As I was telling the administrator of OWA, I said, how could we send migrant workers in millions and then not think of our capacity to provide for their needs, to provide for services? If you have, 7 to 10 million migrants out there, what is our capacity? How much social amelioration fund do we need? How many planes are we going to use to bring them back? For the pandemic, even now, some responses were coming from government. Singapore, for example, realizes that it cannot go on without the migrant labor. So it started to ease the reentry and rehiring of migrant workers. I think the border between Singapore and Malaysia is starting to ease up because during the pandemic, all the workers from Malaysia who were day workers in Singapore could not enter Singapore. There was a lockdown, closed Singapore. And those Malaysian workers who were in Singapore are unable to go to Malaysia. So they stayed in Singapore without any job. But now Singapore is reopening the hiring of construction workers, including domestic workers. It has also introduced reforms in the household services scheme. In the in the home countries, Philippines, for example, is providing cash assistance, free vaccination, hotel and meals, but only for something like 500,000 migrants. What is happening to the rest of the migrant workers? Exactly how many migrant workers are coming home? This is something that perhaps you in the media would like to know, and tell people how many are coming home, because what we only get from the media is how many were vaccinated, how many were not vaccinated, how many were unserved. There are those who are stranded, the seafarers who are unable to land, those unable to leave the destination countries because there is no flight. What? These are areas that media has not really talked about. And coming home with a jobless rate, we had something like 17% unemployment added to the existing unemployment rate already. Clearly, it is not business as usual. Is there any plan of government or private sector? What is the recruitment agencies planning? Is there a foreign employment industry to look at? Before COVID, return and reintegration, save and invest as a strategy was already part of the whole campaign. And migrant workers who saved and invested, as we studied it, were in a much better situation, especially those who invested in agriculture, particularly in the COVID period when food supply chain had to be to continue to be vibrant. Supply of food in the stores, supply of rice, supply of these things. They had to be vibrant. Otherwise, people will go hungry, particularly in the cities. So I just have this tale of two Mrs. Mrs. X, who saved and invested and started to, how do you say, redeem her land, which she has mortgaged when she went out of the country. And upon redemption, was able to go back and farm the land. Now it is a flourishing piece of asset that supports her family and provides jobs to her neighbors. Mrs. Y invested in a resort in one of the islands where surfing has become an attraction. So she has built a resort, a building, and purchased all the paraphernalia for surfing and all those things, restaurant and all. When COVID came, there was a lockdown. And so suddenly no customers were coming. But happily, she was able to have assets that could be diverted to some other use. So she used it as a kitchen, a community kitchen, and people were flocking into that area and started to donate food for the others who were really having difficulties with their food supply. Now, here are some issues to interrogate. And as media would like to contribute to rebuilding an equitable, a more equitable, unprejudiced, and economically robust societies. The biggest challenge of migrant workers is coming home to an economy that is in disarray. And the light at the end of the tunnel, or the going away of COVID, is not going to be a scenario that we can see in the next few years. It's living with or without COVID. Still, will the economy and labor migration as we know it be the same again? The call for this time is job creation, and it should be the work of the whole of society. There are many recommendations being pushed forward by ADB, by ILO, as to how to normalize the situation under COVID. It's a cooperation of the three sectors that are wealth creating in a society. The private business should harness its capital and technology to sustain their jobs with a lot of care. The social sector, where many migrants are, should engage in entrepreneurial activity and create employment, particularly in the micro, small, and medium industries where they have that kind of skill and capacity. There is this small group of young people who joined the UNDP Youth Challenge for Innovation, who are selling the products of Bajaus, the Filipino sea gypsies, to Kuala Lumpur. and the income that they get is used to run the schools of the children of these bajaus who are considered stateless in Malaysia. Those are some of the contributions, small stories as it is called, but they are the ones that make the local economy move. They are the small wheels of local economy that continue to support the social sector. Now, the public sector, although it is already overstretched because of COVID expenses, must support in terms of financial and policy reforms that can lead to a rebooting of the economy. I say rebooting because the economy as it is now is unable to cope with pandemics and problems of this magnitude. And this is particularly addressed to countries of origin like the Philippines. I think there is a lot to do in this area, and we cannot afford to be paralyzed because of COVID. We may be slow in our movements physically, but our minds should be faster in developing innovative and creative ideas to overcome the difficulties that we meet small, slowly, but also contribute to a macroeconomic change. Thank you very much. I hope I have challenged you enough.